Hey guys, so one thing you're going to need to know for the test is you're going to need to be able to identify the parts of the neuron. You're going to need to know the functions of the parts, and then you're going to need to be able to explain the nerve impulse, the action potential that travels through the neuron. And so you're going to have to be able to explain both the anatomy and the physiology of the neuron. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to draw a neuron on a piece of paper. So if you need to pause this, you can. I'm going to draw it as well, and so I'll hold up what I've drawn and we'll kind of talk through it. So go ahead, draw your neuron, and I am drawing two, a presynaptic and postsynaptic. So that means you'll have one neuron that connects to another one at the synapse. So I'm going to label mine, and then I'll show you the labels, and you can check and see if you've got yours labeled correctly. Okay, so here's what I've drawn. I've labeled just my presynaptic neuron, the neuron that comes before the synapse. And I'll just talk about it as you can see my labels, and you can check yours. So the dendrites are at the top. Those are kind of like almost like tree-like branches that come off of the cell body. The cell body is also called the soma. It's funny, I forgot my parentheses over here. But anyway, so the soma is the cell body. The very center there, that circle, is the nucleus. You don't have to label your nucleus, but I put a little nucleus in there. The long extending part right here is the axon. The axon is like the leg or the arm. It's really long. The myelin they kind of look like little marshmallows. They're the protective part of the axon. It's kind of like the rubber casing on a electrical cord that just protects the electricity that goes through it. Also for this, so it helps to protect and to allow for the speed of the electrical impulse to go through quickly. Then you have the axon terminals. Those are at the end. If you think of a terminal as a bus stop or maybe a plane terminal, it's where you depart from. This is where the message leaves from. Then we've got the synapse at the bottom over here, and the synapse, this is a space in between the two neurons. It's a fluid-filled gap. It is just a tiny little space that falls in between the two neurons, and there are neurotransmitters. I drew a little dot right there. The neurotransmitters are actually housed in the axon terminals in these little vesicles or sacs, and they're pushed out into the gap, and they slide into the dendrites on the postsynaptic neuron, into little receptor sites on the dendrites of the next neuron. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a picture of what it looks like close up on the axon terminals. If you want to draw a close-up version, you can, or you can just look for mine. So I'm going to pause this and then show you a zoomed-in version of that. Okay, so what I've shown you here, this is just a really zoomed in picture of an axon terminal. So this is the part of the neuron where the message departs from. So you can see the little neurotransmitters are inside of these little bubbles or sacs. They're called vesicles, and that's where they're housed. Neurotransmitters are just chemicals, and each chemical has a specific message to send. And you've got the synapse here. It's that little gap between neurons. And then I'm covering this up here. We've got the dendrite down here below, and the dendrite has little receptor sites. And the receptor sites are where the neurotransmitters slide into the next dendrite. And they fit like a puzzle piece or like a key in a keyhole. They fit just perfectly in the site that is designated or made for that specific chemical. And so that's the inside of the axon terminal. Okay, what I'm going to have you do next is, can you go ahead and remake those two neurons if you need to, if you need to make another copy. I don't want you to put labels on it because I'm going to have something else that you'll put onto it. So if you need to redraw two neurons, go ahead and redraw them, and I'm going to do that on my board, and I'm going to pause here. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the phases of a nerve impulse. There's three phases. There's the firing of the electrical impulse, and that is known as action potential. So that's as the electricity flows through the neuron. There's the refractory period, which is the point which it needs to recharge. And then there is the resting period, where it's waiting to have a new charge go through, a new impulse go through. So I'm going to talk through how those phases happen. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to start with the dendrites, because that's where the message starts. So I'm going to draw a little bit, I'll talk a little bit, and you can follow along with me if you want to write it down. If you want to write it in your notes, that's okay, or you can just watch. So I'm going to start by putting some negative signs in my neuron because at rest, when there is no electrical impulse going through the neuron, it is at a negative state. So in its neutral state, it is mostly negative, so I'm going to draw some negative charges. Okay, so I've drawn my negative neuron, so it's mostly negatively charged, and it has this positive charge outside of the neuron. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have a neurotransmitter that is going to seep across from the presynaptic neuron, and they're going to jump across into this neuron. So they're going to be jumping across the synapse, and they're going to be jumping into the dendrites and the receptor sites. And as they're doing that, a positive charge is going to start seeping into the soma of this neuron here. So positive charges are going to start seeping into this, what it was, a mostly negatively charged neuron, and so it's going to start to charge this soma as the positives are rushing into this once negatively mostly negatively neutral state. So I'm going to draw my positives coming in. Okay, so our positive charges are seeping into the dendrites and the soma of this neuron, and that is starting to charge the cell body. And whenever the charge is strong enough to produce an electrical impulse to shoot down the axon, we say it's reached the threshold. So the soma is getting charged, and when it reaches the ability to actually fire a strong signal down the axon, we say it's reached the threshold. It's gotten enough of a charge to fire. And when it fires down the axon, that is called action potential. So the action potential fires, it fires down the axon, and it pushes the chemicals out of the axon terminals. And those chemicals are called neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are pushed out into the synapse, and they start to seep into the next neuron through their dendrites. And those chemicals are all sending a specific message, whether that is a message about mood or movement. Whatever the brain is wanting to send, those messages are sending that message as they jump across the synapse. So this is why we call it an electrochemical process. So now I'm going to go back and explain, how can action potential happen? How does this electrical impulse fire down? How does that happen? And we say that it happens because it depolarizes. And so that's the next thing I'm going to explain, depolarization. How can a neuron fire? How does that happen? Okay, so depolarization is what happens as the impulse is going down the neuron, down the axon, and what's happening is it's going from a mostly negative state to a positive state. So when it reaches the threshold, we're going to see a charge rush down the axon. And as it's rushing down, what's happening is the positive charges that were once outside are seeping into the axon. Okay, so they're seeping in, and as they're seeping in, the negative charges are seeping out. And it's happening really fast. But as that impulse shoots down, positives are coming in and negatives are going out. And that is what is pushing that charge all the way down, that electricity all the way down, is positives are rushing in while the negatives rush out. And it's going to change. As it goes down, it changes from positive, or from negative, its neutral state, to positive, and that's called depolarization. That is how the firing, the electrical impulse moves down. It flips from its negative state to now a positive state. Okay, so the neuron has to get back to its natural state. It can't be positive. That is the pushing of the electricity, and so it's not going to have this continuous electrical impulse going through. It's got to go back to its natural state so it can shoot another message through again. And so it cannot remain positive. It needs to go back to its neutral state. So it needs to repolarize. We say it needs to recharge itself and get ready to fire again. And so this is called refractory. So the refractory period is the time in which it repolarizes. It goes back to its neutral state, this negative state. So I've drawn in here the negatives are coming back in to repolarize, to get back to normal, while the positives rush out. And so it's going to get to this state back to where it's neutral and waiting and ready to fire again. Okay, so now that the neuron has recharged itself, it is ready for a new a new charge to go through, a new impulse, a new message to rush through it. It's at its neutral, mostly negative state, and it's just waiting for another charge, to another message to send through it. And so the resting period is the time at which it's ready to have another impulse fire through. Okay, so now we're going to talk about reuptake. So reuptake is a process that happens after the message has been sent. So right now we're at the Axon Terminal, and the Axon Terminal is just right at the end of the neuron, and you can see we've got these neurotransmitters that have been pushed out of the Axon Terminal, and they're going into the next dendrite. They're fitting in those receptor sites perfectly, and whenever this following neuron here, this postsynaptic neuron, whenever it reaches the threshold, the amount it needs to send the message through its whole body, then what will happen is we've got some neurotransmitters that may still be left over in the synapse, and they can't stay there, because if they stay there, they'll continue to fit into this receptor site and they'll continue to send the message. So we need them to get back so that the synapse is clear and ready for the next impulse. So what happens is reuptake. It's like a vacuum. So reuptake is where it sucks these neurotransmitters back up to the vesicles in this neurotransmitter here, or this neuron here. Okay, so I'll show you that just really briefly. Hold on. So essentially reuptake is just the neurotransmitters getting sucked back up into the neuron whenever the message has been sent. So they don't hang out in the synapse. They go back up to the neuron there. Okay, so a few other things that you should know about the nerve impulse is that every time it fires through the neuron, it will fire with the same intensity every time. That principle is called the all or nothing principle, or the all or none principle. That once it's reached threshold, it will fire, the action potential will fire with the same speed down the axon every single time. The only exception would be if there is a disease present, like multiple sclerosis, which is eating away at the myelin. And if that's the case, that would slow the message down, but in a normal functioning nervous system, you're going to have that message going through with the same speed every time, and that's the all or nothing principle. I think that's it. I think if you get down the three phases and you can explain depolarization and repolarization, and I think you'll be good. So if you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email or come and talk to me. Okay, thanks.